Tinotenda vari pasi nevari kumatenga. Tinasima kutiunganidza pano nhasi. Pakupemberera vana vese vari kushandirwa kunze kwenyika. Nevese vanotambudzika. Nesi tese tiri pano. Tinopa kutenda masimba enyu amunotipa kuti tifambe munzvimbo dzakasiyana siyana. Tinotenda.
Well, if that can't capture your attention, nothing can. So, so thank you to the marvelous musicians. Thank you for this podium. I'm Jane Wales. I want to welcome you to the Global Philanthropy Forum. We're a community, and we're really glad you're part of us. So this wonderful opening, I should note, was made possible by a GPF supporter and member, Maya Kirsten, who is somewhere out there. And the brilliant work of Michael Olmsted, who's also, Gary was on the keyboard, and he's, you'll get to know him throughout your time here. They agree with us that the Global Philanthropy Forum is not just about strategies and impact and outcome of it, it's also about heart. And it's also really about both inspiration and learning and the caring that motivates all the work that you do. So in the couple days we have together, today and tomorrow and Friday, you're going to be deep into your left brain a lot of the time, wrestling with problems, seeking out solutions, but you'll also be drawn back to that right brain, where so much of learning and inspiration and wonderment really occur. At the same time, you'll be seeing, meeting lots of remarkable innovators who are doing work really around the world. And their ideas are really the spark that ignites social change. And so I look forward to your meeting each of them. We're starting this year with the proposition that governments can set goals, they can mobilize resources, they can coordinate action. But if they really want to eradicate poverty, which is the shared goal, if they want to really meet their bold objectives, they'll need to join forces with citizen activists, citizen innovators from just about every sector and every discipline and corner of the world. And they'll need to take into account the role that human ingenuity plays and the role that human nature plays. And so you're going to hear a lot about that as well. We think that process of collaboration is already happening, that cross-sectoral collaboration, the interaction between institutions and individuals as well. And that in the process, you're seeing kind of a redefinition take place, a redefinition of concepts of markets and value, of service and learning, of philanthropy, of leadership, and of development itself. And so what we're going to ask you to do is, as you think of examples of that kind of redefinition going on, that you share those examples with one another, that you tweet them using hashtag GPF14 GPF14 redefine, and that will be a way to share that knowledge among us. Our first speakers are going to open with the central development challenge of the day, and that's inequality. And we're talking about inequality in rich countries, in poor countries, and in middle-income countries, because that's where the poor live. You know, growth may be robust, but it is not always broad-based, and while development can be pretty rapid in a lot of societies, that doesn't necessarily mean it's inclusive. So when we think about development today, we don't just think about GDP. We think about well-being as well, and so that'll be much of the conversation. Now, while we'll open with that and the ways in which development has been redefined, we're going to close with the sort of last sea change in the world of poverty alleviation and development. Because it was 25 years ago that Gro Brundtland, a young politician or political office holder from Norway, who had been prime minister and led the World Health Organization. She headed up a commission that authored a report that we all refer to as the Brundtland Report. And what was so significant about that report is that it introduced for the first time the notion of sustainable development. And it defined sustainable development as a pattern of development in which we meet the needs of today in such a way that we preserve the capacity of future generations to meet their needs as well. And so that is, we're going to close with her. Her thoughts have been, in fact, this concept has been guiding us all this time and will inform our conversation for the 3 days to come. Now, while our plenaries are going to be sort of shared snapshots of the state of the field and the state of play in the various issue areas where you all work, the heart of the conference is going to be elsewhere. The heart of the conference is going to be in working groups. Again, this is where you roll up your sleeves, you reason together, you learn together, and you try to find real solutions together. And what's important here is that the agenda is set by you. And that will be the heart of the conference. There'll be skilled facilitators that'll help you move it along. You won't be all alone. And you'll be side by side with folks doing work in all parts of the world. But those facilitators are going to put forth a core question, and they're going to ask you, how would philanthropy change? How would policy change? How would business practice change if the real goal were well-being, human well-being, and the well-being of our planet, if the real measure were dignity, and if the real method was the capture of human ingenuity? And they will ask you, they'll ask you at the end, beginning and end of those sessions, what your view is. Now, for those who want to take those ideas or take the sort of opportunities that are unveiled and pursue them, We're going to be setting aside breakfast tables. This does mean getting up in the morning. And at those breakfast tables, you can get together, forge partnerships, use that as your opportunity to find ways to work together going forward. And for those of you, in fact, I should say that one of the tables has already been claimed by the UN Development Program and our friends at the Hilton Foundation, and Heather Grady is going to help lead it. And this is an effort to gain your input on the follow-on to the Millennium Development Goals. I think their point of view is, look, if you're part of that solution, if you're part of executing on those goals, they very much want you to be part of setting those goals. And so I know that's going to be one of the breakfasts. But for those of you who want to use that time period just to deepen learning, what you'll find is that we have tables set aside for that. We've got people who have agreed to host table talks among you. And you'll find, in fact, in your program books, those that have been reserved in advance. So you can see where you'd like to have breakfast, if that is what you'd like to do. Now, the other thing I want to tell you is that, look, we are a community, and so the idea is that you get to know each other. And here's one way. If you suffer from any kind of shyness, which, I've seen no evidence of that, but one way is to take this flair in which you kind of declare what matters to you most. Is it women and girls? Is it education? Is it health? Is it the environment? And you put that flair, or those flares, many people have multiple flares, on your name tag. And that way you can find one another and a conversation has begun. And I think it's tomorrow night we have a Find Your Flair reception. So if you haven't, make sure you get these. While you're doing that, while you're introducing yourself to one another, I would urge that you seek out the philanthropists who are leading the effort to replicate the Global Philanthropy Forum in regions around the world. So there, I know that Pearl Darko is here, who leads the African Philanthropy Forum. I'm sure she would be eager to introduce you to the African philanthropists who have joined us today. And I know that I've seen Marcos Kisil and Paola Fabiani. I saw them both last night, and they lead the Brazilian Philanthropy Forum. They're both of Aegis, which leads the Brazilian Philanthropy Forum, and they have come with a delegation of 20 Brazilian philanthropists, so practice up on your Portuguese. Their next conference will be in early November in Sao Paulo, so I'm sure they'd be eager to get you to join them. Now, you can have your friends join our plenaries, and what we're going to do, because we're broadcasting everything live, so what we're going to do is put on the screens both the way in which to access those sessions online, but also the ways in which you can tweet using the hashtag of GPF14. Now, if you want to have as close to a paperless conference as possible, we urge you to use GPF Connect. And the way you use it, Ginger Soul uses it to share her business card rather than going with lots of little cards. You can use it to find one another, introduce yourselves to one another, and you can use it to keep a conversation going, and we hope you will. And then finally, while I'm talking about paperless things, you'll see on our paperless opportunities, you'll see on your tables this little guy. And what this little guy is a book. And it's a book put together, it's a study put together by the World Bank. And the issue here, actually I'm going to make too much noise with that, but what this is it describes a means by which to gain beneficiary feedback from citizens around the world. And after all, that's what really matters to all of us, is how do you make sure that what you're doing is relevant, that it really serves the needs that you're trying to address. So this is a way to use modern technology to achieve that goal. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the first panel. And what I'm going to do, in fact, is instead of introducing the first panel, I'll introduce the first panel chair and then turn over the introductions to her. Marina Gorbis is the executive director of the Institute for the Future. She's a social scientist, and in her day job, what she does is she brings a futures perspective to organizations in the public, private, and philanthropic sector. So she has that broad view, and we have an opportunity to be led through this first conversation by Marina. So please join me in welcoming Marina and her fellow panelists to the stage.
Thank you. My panelists. Anywhere you want. It's here.
I'm just following directions.
Figure out, right? Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, great. It's a beautiful morning, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's a real honor to be in the company of this particular group. We were meeting for breakfast and conversation before the panel, and I confessed to this group, so I might as well confess to you, that I increasingly think of myself as a recovering economist because the first 15 years of my life, I spent it in doing economic development work in various parts of the world, and also here in the United States, in different states. And we were very proud of all the methodologies that we had, cluster analysis. We were looking at all the economic foundations. We were looking at the financial systems, and we were looking at human resources and regulation and all of that. We were very, very exhaustive in terms of how we thought about development. And then I came to the Institute about 15 years ago, and I started working with a lot of anthropologists who look at things like culture. And I figured out that that's what was missing from a lot of economic theory. These people were going into people's homes. They were trying to understand. They were living with people, and they were really trying to understand what is it on the ground? What are these lives of people on the ground? What drives them? What fears? What hopes they have? And it kind of inspired me to really rethink a lot of development theory, a lot of how we practice development. And so I've personally been on this path of trying to create a new language where we can bring together people who speak the language of culture, which is kind of anathema to a lot of economists, right? We don't know how to talk about culture. We don't know how to describe what it is. The whole conversation about changing the vocabulary and who participates in the development conversation. How do we bring more voices into this? How do we bring artists and designers and anthropologists and others to kind of really expand how we think what development, even what is that word development, what does it mean, and how do we practice it, and what is the tools and language that we can use. So I'm hoping that in this panel we can address some of these issues, and you're the perfect group to really be addressing that. What we're going to do is we're going to have each of the panelists give a few remarks from their perspective, their lens of looking at development. And it's as I said, it's a pretty amazing panel. We have Khalid Malik, who is the head of UNDP Human Development Report. I have to say that the report is like a Bible for a lot of people who are thinking about development and economics and a lot of other things. And in its own right, it's a huge innovation, expanding the whole notion of what development and economic development is all about. So we're going to start with Khalid, and then we have Sanjay Pradhan, who is a vice president of the World Bank and was the head of the World Bank Institute, where he was thinking a lot about open governance and data and all kinds of other things, and is now leading efforts to really transform the bank and leadership and around the world. So welcome to you. And finally, but not least, we have Rachel Glennerster, who is the executive director of the Poverty Action Lab at Harvard, at MIT. And she, I know, very different, right? Close, but very different. And she actually has a lot of on-the-ground knowledge because she's been doing a lot of evaluation work, looking community-based development in agriculture and in health and many other areas in many parts of the world, including Sierra Leone. So this is a great group to be addressing redefining development issues. We're going to start with you, Khalid. Yes.
Well, good morning, everyone. Great to be here, and thank you so much for inviting us. I have an old-fashioned slide presentation, but I promise I will not go through it too carefully. I wanted to just start by acknowledging that how important ideas and how important individuals are. Three in particular I want to just acknowledge. Bill Draper, who was here this morning but had to leave. Mahbub al-Haq and Amartya Sen, 3 people who came together to launch an idea of development, which is fundamentally about people, about putting people first, about their choices, and how important it is to see development from that perspective. And I think that has transformed the way we look at development and has transformed at least the way we measure development. In 1990, there was the first report issued. It starts with a very powerful phrase: people are the real wealth of nations. And by the way, all the empirical work and all the analysis shows that if you look after people, economies and societies look after themselves. And that is really the fundamental perspective which we have. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2013 report, which is a very hopeful report. It's about a changing world, the rise of the South. And I'll say a few words at the very end about philanthropy and what are the implications of some of those issues. And if this thing works, let's see here. I'm going to put out a few slides to just give you an idea how dramatic the change is in the last decade or so. And it's dramatic because because we are in it, we don't fully feel it, but historians will talk about this change in a very kind of large sense. And if the Industrial Revolution was a 100 million people story, this is actually a few billion people story. Something like 40+ countries have done better than expected, and billions of people are doing better than expected. And this is an interesting line also about the middle class. You know, by 2030, 2/3 of the middle class will be from Asia and the Pacific. The world is changing and changing quite rapidly. All kinds of implications for sustainability, lifestyles, consumption, you name it. But we are in a very rapidly changing environment. This is also interesting because it shows 3 countries, Brazil, India, and China, and 6 traditionally important countries from the West, how they have already intersected in terms of collective weight in the world. And this is also interesting because it shows that reserves, most of the reserves now are in developing countries, something like $6 trillion worth of reserves, and which we have made some recommendations how they can be thought about and talked about. So that's just to give you a big picture sense, but also talk about greater connectivity. There are more internet users in the developing world than there are in the developed world. 600 million people in China on the web. And boy, do they put a lot of pressure on government, on interacting with each other, and I'll come back to that particular point. So this is the changing world in which we live in. I'll skip a whole bunch of other slides and go directly to, let's see if this works, the future. Jane talked about how we can come together and see how we can think. And since we have a person dealing with the Institute of the Future, I thought in the 2013 report, we highlighted a couple of big mega challenges. And it's fundamentally about people. In the end, people need nurturing, and they will nurture other things. And we try to understand how that will present itself. We did a lot of data analysis and tried to see from developed and developing countries what role inequality plays, not just income, but also health and education in development progress. And across the board, you can see that any movement towards greater equality improves a huge range of indicators, from female child pregnancy issues to economic growth. So the move towards equality is profoundly important. We also saw that the issue of connectedness, people are getting more educated, and that's a good thing. They're also getting more connected. And this is the core of what happened in the Arab Spring, that when that happens, the relationship between citizen and state changes. People expect more. They expect better governance, they expect more transparency, they expect more jobs, and they put a lot of pressure on governments. So governments have to learn how to manage those complex pressures just much better. And jobs is supremely important. I also thought I'll put up a slide on environmental challenges. The reality is that we are in a very complicated situation, and recently the UN IPCC report came out and said essentially that most countries are not on a sustainable path. The developed countries, this is a diagram which looks at Human Development Index on one side, our measure of progress, and the ecological footprint. And basically, if you look at the carrying capacity of the world, most developed countries are far beyond that. That's on the right-hand side. Most developing countries are generally low, but as they progress, that will also become a challenge for the future. So we have to do more on that. We also look at demography, and what is fascinating is that fertility rates are collapsing almost everywhere except a few countries in Africa. And the key to that is education. Education helps in so many different ways in terms of fertility rates, in terms of how health is organized, and also in terms of jobs, remarkably enough. That for us, people talk about the demographic dividend, and those who may have followed the economist debates a few years ago, they were comparing India and China and say, who will do better in the long term? And the answer is, it depends how you manage your long term. And the fundamental to that is whether it's a declining population or increasing population. In both cases, you have to manage it carefully. In the case of Africa, for instance, we are 1 billion people now, sub-Saharan Africa. By 2050, it'll be 2 billion people. And depending on the policies, you can actually predict whether poverty will go down quite substantially, or poverty will go up to extreme cases of over 1 billion people poor in sub-Saharan Africa in the future. It depends on what we do. And now I'll come very quickly to a few thoughts on the philanthropy. So clearly, we are living in a new world, the new players. The 2014 report, which will be coming up in July, is on vulnerability, maybe a less hopeful message than the 2013 one. But it gives you a little mega perspective on volumes of resources going to different countries and how important many partners are. So therefore, partnership is key. Private sector, civil society, and the governments. No one can do it on their own. And a final slide, and I'll stop at this point because I know I have a short time, is that all the things you see are in rapid transition. Therefore, new partnerships are the key to bringing many players together, because without partnerships, you cannot have a good influence. We've also encouraged a new principle called coherent pluralism and also responsible sovereignty, which is not there. And responsible sovereignty is about that the world is so globally connected that it's no longer possible for nation states easily to take policies which can improve citizens' life. You have to take the world into your policy making. So responsible sovereignty is about looking globally, and that's very important. It's somewhat controversial at this stage, but we hope that in time, as we started, controversy starts first, you pick up, and there's global consensus. The second point, and I'll stop at this thing, is about public goods. The balance between private markets and public provided things is going to define how we can be sustainable in the future. And I'll give you the example of public transport. One of our advisory board members, who's a very eminent senator from Brazil, said that recently, a few years ago, salaries of university professors went down. And what happened? There were two immediate things which happened. People started taking their children out of private schools into public schools. And they then themselves started going from abandoning their cars and going into public transport. But in both cases, they realized the quality wasn't very high. In both cases, they got much more engaged in making certain quality actually worked. The footprint of each one of us will determine our future. A good, quick macro perspective. I hope you have a chance to look at the Human Development Reports. We are both in the virtual world, but also in the real world. We can have copies available to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just curious, how many people have read the development report? Good. good number. Great.
And it's available.
And it's available, yes, so do read it. It's great reading. Great. Think of questions. We're going to open after all the panelists speak. We're going to open it to questions. I want to turn it over to Sanjay. Some of the messages from Khalid's talk is about connectivity, about rearrangement of institutional rearrangement. It's something that's very familiar to you, something you think about a lot. Before turning it over to you, I just want to say that you probably know that World Bank President Dr. Kim is going to be joining this group by video link tomorrow. So you have cards on your table, and if there are questions you want to address to him, please fill out those cards, include your affiliation and name, and the staff is going to be collecting those, and we'll pass them on to him for tomorrow. Sanjay.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Marina. Can you hear me? Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to actually begin with, I thought of it on the plane here. I wanted to begin with a personal story, if I could, which in my mind epitomizes both the promise and the imperative of redefining the development paradigm from one which was a very traditional approach to a citizen-centric approach. And I want to share with you this story, which dates back about 20 years ago when I joined the World Bank. And one of my first assignments was to work on Uganda, where my job was to provide concessional loans and grants to the government of Uganda. And just before doing this loan, we had done a public expenditure review of Uganda, where we found that there were very poor educational and health outcomes and very low spending on primary education and health. So when we were giving this loan in a very traditional development paradigm, we said that this loan would be used to enhance spending on primary education and primary health. And that was applauded. We went to the board. I got promoted as a consequence. But after I got promoted, after some time, I took a field trip to rural Uganda. And I encountered that schools had been built, but teachers and textbooks didn't show up. I found health clinics had been built, but there were no medicines. And the poor, who were supposed to benefit from this, the local communities, had no idea of what they were expected to receive. And they had no voice in articulating their concerns. Shortly after that, we did the famous Uganda Public Expenditure Tracking Survey, which traced how much of those enhanced allocations actually received the schools. And we found that 90% of the funds did not reach the schools. And that was quite striking. And at that point, spurred by greater government and donor attention, but also a public dissemination campaign, where the information was posted on billboards and community radio on what citizens were supposed to receive, over a period of time, that leakage came down from 90% to 10%, which was quite striking. And then Rachel informed me this morning that there was a recent study. There was a study subsequently, which was quite striking, where the school providers, or the providers and the local communities were brought together to understand the needs of the community. And when that demand and supply side of governance came together, both service delivery and outcomes improved. Now, this little vignette gives you a glimpse of how we need to change the traditional paradigm. And I want to share with you that over a period of the last several years, there has been a process of experimentation and innovation, which together amount to a transformation. They're not there yet. These are nascent movements. But if together in forums like this, if we can forge partnerships, we can turn this into a revolution. And for this, I want to share with you what I consider to be 4 frontier elements of this redefinition of development, the topic of this conference, which we can together scale up into a transformation. The first frontier movement I want to suggest is to move from having development assistance aid and government spending, which is often non-transparent and inaccessible to the citizenry, to going towards open aid and open government. And let me illustrate what I mean. First is open aid. To open up aid in the World Bank, for instance, we decided to take a move. So we have geocoded 30,000 projects in 144 countries, which basically means we locate these projects on a map and correlate it with the indicators they were supposed to serve. We have now forged a partnership with 12 donors, 7 foundations and international civil society organizations, and a number of countries to geocode all development assistance through what we call the Open Aid Partnership. But of course, doing development assistance to be open is cute, but what's really important is if we can make government spending itself transparent and accessible to the citizenry, because the goal is to enhance domestic accountability of the state to the citizens. And to do this, I want to share with you that we are now working to geocode budgets in about 30 countries. And what does that mean? Let me go back to my reference point, which is Uganda. So envision a map of Uganda, where you can locate all the districts of Uganda and the education sector. And the districts that are colored by the color green are those districts that have low spending on education, but good educational outcomes. And those districts that are colored red are those districts that have high spending on education, but poor education outcomes. This geocoding of the budget immediately transforms what is an inscrutable budget document of hundreds of pages, which even public finance experts like myself cannot understand, into an understandable visual, which citizens can understand and hold their government to account. So as I said, we are working in about 30 countries. But the role of this forum, this type of partnership, would be to work together to get these 30 countries to actually publicly disseminate this geocoded budget. They're not all doing this. And if we can do it in more countries, and then build the capacity of civil society, media, and parliaments to understand this budget, then we start to get a citizen-centered budget. So that's the first transformation. The second is to not stop there, but to ensure that citizen voice and feedback is integrated into policy design, into budgeting, into service delivery, really putting citizens at the heart, at the center. So go back to budgeting. Brazil has pioneered, and Jane asked us to share examples. I'll be sharing a few examples. Brazil has pioneered mobile participatory budgeting. Basically, citizens vote on the budget. And imagine, we did a South-to-South exchange, the point that Khalid talked about, the rise of the South. We did a South-South exchange between Brazil and the DRC. And DRC, which in a fragile and conflict setting, faced the imperative of rebuilding trust in government, decided to allocate in South Kivu province an item of the budget which is directly voted on by the citizens using mobile phones. And as a consequence, citizens started to see roads being built, bridges being repaired that they wanted to see. And amazingly, tax collection jumped 15 times in South Kivu province, demonstrating a rebuilding of trust in government. Now, what we are seeing in DRC in health, we are seeing in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in urban, we are seeing in the Philippines, platforms like checkmyschool.org in the Philippines. If you type up checkmyschool.org, you will see a platform, an internet site, where parents and students can give real-time feedback using mobile phones and the internet, where the teachers and textbooks are showing up in school. The same problem I encountered when I started my journey in Uganda. Tools like this can be quite transformational. You'll talk to President Kim tomorrow. He declared and announced a few months ago that 100% of World Bank finance projects that have an identified beneficiary will integrate citizen feedback. That's quite powerful if we can make it happen. And the flash drive that Jane talked about, which is on your desks, is a recent study that we did, not as robust as if we can get Rachel to work with us on this, which starts to say that these innovations are promising, but local context matters a lot. Some things work in some contexts, they don't in others. And technology cannot be the driver. It can be a great enabler if you have conditions. And one of the conditions, which is very powerful, takes me to the third frontier. And the third frontier, which is really profound if you think of it, that we are learning, is that one of the key enabling conditions for a citizen-centered approach is to simultaneously build the capacity of civil society organizations to amplify the voice of the poor, and simultaneously build the capacity of governments to respond to that feedback. Now, what is happening in this space is that you have foundations like yourselves and others who have been working with civil society organizations to amplify the voice of the citizens. but governments are not necessarily responding to that. And we in the World Bank and other institutions work with governments to support them, but they're not necessarily responding to the citizen feedback. So we built a platform called the Global Partnership for Social Accountability, which is a unique bridge. It is a partnership between institutions like the World Bank. We now have 3 foundations who have become partners, financial partners, Ford, Open Society, and the Aga Khan Foundation. We have 130 global partners that have joined in. And what it's seeking to do is to give grants to civil society organizations so they can be the voice of the citizens and help governments that we support through our financing respond to that feedback. The GPSA, as we abbreviate it, becomes a link, a bridge between the demand and supply side of governance. And I would submit to you that's a real frontier. And to bring it to life again, as Jane asked, to give you a concrete example, in the Philippines, where there's a massive conditional cash transfer program, we are supporting concerned citizens of ABRA, which is a civil society organization, which is monitoring whether the poor are receiving these benefits of CCTs. And at the same time, this report goes to the Secretary for Social Protection in the government, and we are financing the programs that helps the Secretary and the government respond to that feedback. I would submit to you that if more of us joined platforms like this, we can bridge this demand and supply of governance, which has to be the frontier. And that takes me to the last frontier where I'll stop. The real goal here is not just to build capacity of citizens and government, but to forge coalitions for action. Many of our countries, there's entrenched networks of corruption, and we need to forge multi-stakeholder coalitions. And this goal, like in contracts, there's so much corruption in contracts, you need to help reformers in government, civil society, private sector, forge coalitions, build their collaborative leadership. And that's one of the areas we're working on. But since I'm out of time, I can address this in the question-answer session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So, this is really interesting, particularly here in this area, because there's so much, this is Silicon Valley, there's so much excitement about technologies and open government and data and open data. Virtually every day there's a hackathon or something going on where people are working with open data. So it's falling on the right ears here. But Rachel, though, you are on the ground, you're doing evaluations. I don't know if there's enough data yet on these attempts at open governance and open budget and all of that. What are you seeing on the ground? How you view this?
Great, thanks, and great to be back here at the Global Philanthropy Forum. So I want to just start by mentioning what I see as one of the big changes in development over the last few years, which is the dramatic rise in the reliance on rigorous evidence to test what approaches work to reduce poverty and what approaches are less successful, and where things work and where they don't. And this rigorous testing has led us to understand that some conventional wisdoms that we thought we understood aren't actually true. And it's also brought to the fore some really innovative ideas, particularly that have come up from citizens groups and small local NGOs. And I think there's a reason why citizens groups, NGOs, social entrepreneurs have been at the forefront of this work, is that it's a couple of reasons. One is they're really great at innovating. They're willing to take risks, try new things, and if things don't work, they'll move on to something else. They've also really pioneered partnerships, innovative partnerships with academics. So you see, over the last few years, we've seen these partnerships develop with often small local NGOs trying something new, brainstorming with top academics from MIT, also Harvard, I should say. You weren't so far off. And trying new things, learning about what's worked elsewhere. We've had, again, some really interesting South-South brainstorming, and then testing these ideas. And finally, I think another reason why these groups have been so important is they understand that resources are limited. They recognize that they can't do everything. They don't have enough money. And what the academics did is said, well, let's take that constraint and think of it as an opportunity to rigorously evaluate. So what our group does is we take the concept of the randomized trial for medicine and apply it to social and economic programs. So if an NGO can only afford to work in 100 schools, we'll say, okay, go and find 200 that meet your needs. And then we'll randomly pick 100 of them, and you can implement the program there, and then we can monitor the outcomes in the 100 schools that got the program and the 100 that didn't. And that allows you to very rigorously test the impact of the program. Now, this kind of research has been happening in economics and social programs for decades, but there have been a bunch of innovations that have made it cheaper, smarter, more flexible, so that it fits with the needs of people on the ground. And as you say, you should come back to economics, because we spend a lot of time on the ground now in people's homes, trying to understand how they think and what's really going on. And for me, I used to work at the IMF and in government, and it's extraordinary how coming into academia, I actually spent more time peering down wells in huts and villages and really understanding the local context, which I think is absolutely critical. Now, this work has expanded, from that early pioneer work to international agencies. The World Bank's doing a huge amount of this work. It's going into new areas. We're trying to figure out how to measure all sorts of concepts like women's empowerment, trust in post-conflict environment. How do we put a number on that? How do you, and there we're actually working a lot with anthropologists and using some of their techniques. And we're learning not just about whether a particular program works, but what motivates people. What are the underlying problems that are causing, for example, people to underinvest in preventative health, something we see throughout the world, from the US to Sierra Leone, where I work. People will pay a lot to cure disease, but they're very reluctant to invest in preventative health. Why is that, and what can we do? And we're using a lot of psychology now to understand that, but also to design smarter programs. But I want to come back to the theme of this panel, which is how citizens can make government work more effectively. And we've seen this big rise in democracy throughout the developing world. And I guess people are sometimes a little jaded. We see a lot of corrupt politicians. We see them get re-elected, even though people know they're corrupt. So what's going on? We see teachers not showing up, just as Sanjay was talking about. How do we solve that problem? There's been a lot of work of the kind that Sanjay's talked about, of trying to get citizens involved locally to put pressure on, to improve services. And some of those have worked well, like they did in Uganda, and sometimes it hasn't worked at all well. And I think this is an area we've still got to do a lot of experimentation to understand why things work and why they don't. But something I'm excited about is, I feel like sometimes we gave up on democracy in that process. We expected the poor to monitor the teachers and make sure they show up. Now, I don't do that with my kids' teachers. I vote, and I expect the local government to monitor teachers themselves. So are there ways that citizens can get involved and make democracy itself work better and get politicians to be more effective? And there are a number of really interesting recent studies that have showed that that is a very effective approach. I want to talk about just a few of them. In Afghanistan, and these were all tested by randomized trials. So in Afghanistan, there was a campaign to take pictures of the voting returns at polling stations and record those and send them back, collect them nationally. And where people knew that was going to happen, where it was announced randomly this was going to happen, there was less corruption in the polling. In Kenya, there was a massive trial of sending out text messages to encourage people to register and to vote. Again, that increased turnout. In India, where an awful lot of MPs have criminal records, there was a work and a lot of corruption in the money that's given to MPs. There was a work by a local NGO, SNS, to compile report cards on members of parliament and feed that back to the citizenry so that they understood the different candidates, you know, whether they had a criminal record, how they'd spent the money that they'd been given. And even though the literacy rates in these communities were extremely high, the illiteracy rates were extremely high, we see a very sophisticated response of the citizenry to this information and really dramatic changes in who people are voting for. I've been involved in work in Sierra Leone where illiteracy is very high. 70% of the people we were working with have 0 years of education. And there are very few forms of getting information out to communities about their MPs. So you see what you see in a lot of the developing world, a lot of ethnic-based voting. So people in the north, people from the Timni group will vote for one party, people from the south will vote for another. And people, you know, the reaction is, well, what can you do? You can't change this very deep-seated, ethnically based voting. But the other perspective is maybe people are voting based on ethnicity because they don't know anything else about the candidates. Why not base your vote on ethnicity when you don't know who the candidates are? And so we worked with a local group funded through Search for Common Ground, who looked at, they videotaped debates between members of parliament, and then they screened those in communities around the country. And where that happened, we saw a massive increase in understanding about what the issues were in the campaign, who the candidates were, and we see a sharp change in people's willingness to vote for different candidates. So I think this really showed that even somewhere, and I was on Good Morning Sierra Leone recently, and the journalists were saying, but I don't believe it. You know, our communities, the people just vote ethnically. And I said, no, we've scientifically looked at that, and people are willing to change their vote if they understand who the candidates are and have seen them debate, and they know what their issues are. We also saw, again, people are worried that, debates in the US, we worry, well, they're just, you just end up voting for who is best looking. Or did you know, for example, that you can predict the outcome of a Senate race in the US by just showing people the photographs of the Senate candidates? So there was a lot of concern that if you show a debate, you're just going to enhance those issues and not the fundamental issues. But what we see is that local people are voting for those candidates. After seeing the debate, they're more likely to vote for candidates who have the same priorities as them. If I care about education, I'm going to vote for someone in education. So I'm really excited about the prospect of bringing citizens groups in to enhance the formal process of democratic accountability.
It's interesting. I'm personally involved with an organization called Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which is an amazing organization of reporters from all over the world, and they're tracking corruption trails through banks and all of that, and they're the ones who are uncovering all the Yanukovych's papers and piecing it all together. And one thing, you all kind of talked about governance and transformation of institutions, and we're kind of in this interesting period where we do have a lot of data, at least a lot of people have a lot more data, and it looks like almost, and people also can easily come together and they can change governments. Arab Spring, Ukraine, other places. But have we changed? Behind that, the process of actually creating, it's different to take down the government and vote somebody out. But has anything changed in terms of creating governance systems, government and governance, like putting it in place? We're seeing it again in Ukraine and other places that have you seen, can we speed up that process, or what can we do? Or is that process still a very, very long, involved process? And is data a piece of that? Does it help? I mean, frankly, some of the examples you're using, I would love to use them in the US. It's a typical example of innovation coming back to the US, and we could use some of that here. But talk about data and building capacity and governance system. And you talked about the need for institutional changes, rearrangement. Can you talk more about what it means briefly, and then we'll open it to the floor.
In terms of listening to all the great presentations, it occurred to me that there's a kind of challenge between macro issues and very specific programs which may improve this or that. And I think what is challenging is somehow you have to find some synergy between the two. And I'll give a very specific example. If you educate people, you have a very different conversation than if you're not educated. So who takes the responsibility for education? So you have to find a way to somehow have free, public, compulsory education. So countries which have done that, you have a very different conversation than those who have not done that. And states have a responsibility. I mean, that's a very basic relationship. I think what is fascinating for me is that in the new report we are highlighting that Scandinavian countries in the late 19th century, early 20th century took very profound decisions about health, education, social insurance, and per capita income levels which are lower than what South Asia has now. Mm-hmm. But South Asia, the debate is about, well, government can't do it because government is not very effective, therefore we must go for private schooling or privately done health systems. The minute you have these kind of debates, it basically highlights that you need some basic investments. So that's the first point. The second point would be, there's also a debate within all of us who deal with these matters, that do you have good institutions as a result of development? Or do you need good institutions to produce development? So, and maybe the reality is somewhere in between. And therefore, technocratic fixes are fine, but they can only go so far, because in the end, national leaders and national institutions have to do the heavy lifting and find ways to move things forward. And I contrast even the issues of democracy between, say, China and Pakistan. China, you have a communist party which knows that for its own longevity, it has to produce measurable improvements in people's lives. In Pakistan, we have all the trappings of democracy, regular elections, but it's a very different kind of conversation because the poor are not part of that conversation easily, even though they vote regularly. So I think the life is very complex, but I think partnerships are key. But we also have to understand that you have to link somehow the macro with the micro. It's just very difficult only working at the micro or only working at the macro. And I like this whole notion of this idea of redefining citizenship. I think that's the core, because people are more educated. They know what's happening. Farmers in Africa on the mobile are very up to date on politics in the US, for that matter. So they know that their rights mean something, and they know that they want to insist on it. Now, whether the institution can respond to it, I think all that is good, even though it's unsettled period right now on the mismatch between what they expect and what people can actually respond. And in the end, Amartya Sen, his book on development is as a freedom. Individuals have a huge way of influencing the world in which they live in. So if you empower them, if you increase their, what we call human agency, many things are possible. And that comes back to education and health again. Thanks.
Marina, in answer to your question on governance systems, 3 points I wanted to make. One is there was a very nice framework that the World Development Report 2003 had put out on 3 routes of accountability to get better delivery of services. And you can locate all the strands of this conversation in that. The first strand was between citizens and elected officials. How to get better elections, better accountability, which is what Rachel talked about. So that's one route. If you get better elections, better political, that's one route. They called it the long route of accountability because it takes time. The second is between elected officials and the bureaucracy. which may be what you may be referring to, which is how do you get the bureaucratic apparatus to be more responsive. And the third, which they call the short route of accountability, which has some of the examples I gave, but not all of them, which is about citizens directly holding providers to account or getting that feedback going. Ultimately, in terms of a governance system, you need all of this. And the second point, therefore, is that you need to be opportunistic, where you have the entry points on the long route, the short route, or the bureaucratic, and they're not either-ors. And this is exactly Khalid's point about the link between the macro and the micro. You need the long route of accountability, but you also need to be opportunistic and deliver services better. And the last point I would make is data and transparency is crucial to make any of these links work. You need better data for elections, you need better data in terms of whether citizens are receiving services, and you need better data for bureaucratic accountability, performance of public agencies. So I would look at it as a system, but be pragmatic, because we can't wait for all of these things in different types of contexts.
Yeah, and I think one part of it is with data is that people are now creating their own maps of the terrain. So it's not the data that comes from some agency. They can create maps of crime. They can create maps of all kinds of potholes and all of that. So that changes the dynamic also, how people look at what's important to them.
Yeah, and I'd say on that last point on data, and we have to be careful in thinking about what we can achieve by just putting out data, because people have to be able to understand it and be able to respond to it. So I think that's one of the interesting questions about why informing people of the bad services and starting a dialogue in Uganda was extremely effective. We tried the same thing in India on education, nothing. We told them, that the local schools weren't working and they weren't spending the money they were meant to, nothing. We tried another approach, which was, and this is how you can change things and teach your child to read. This was an evaluation of a group, Pradhan, a very big NGO from India, and they tried informing people about the quality of local schools, and these are the ways in which you can get reform in your local school, and people didn't respond. When they said, and here's how we'll train you to teach your children to read in an after-school camp, dramatic improvements in reading.
That's local context.
So then they said, well, we don't want to just do this out of school. We want to figure out how to end up changing the public system. So I think I exactly agree with Sanjay that you've got to find the right entry points in a given system. And while I was talking, today, because we have a short amount of time about the electoral governance, there's also a lot of work on building these microsystems at many different levels. We've got to figure out, we're getting kids in school now, but a lot of them aren't learning to read. We've got to make the quality of education, the quality of healthcare better. And I agree fundamentally that that's what, if we teach, improve the quality of services, and people learn, get good human capital, education, and health, they'll figure out how to fix the rest.
And I think what's really exciting about it also is that citizenship then becomes a way of educating the population also, which we sort of separated the two, and now we're bringing them together. I want to open it to questions. If you have questions, there are mic runners here. If you can just stand up and say your name and affiliation. Let me see. I see a hand over there, and it's dark here and here. Okay. Here we're going to go over there, and then here, and then here, and then over there if we have time. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Esther Amarakwe. I'm from Nigeria. My question goes to UNDP and to all the panels. What is the role of young people in redefining development? I haven't heard anyone mention young people throughout the conversation. Thank you.
So, the role of young people and brief answer.
Take a few.
Do you want to do that? Let's hear other questions. Yeah.
I'm Radhika Shah. I'm the chapter leader of the local Ashoka Silicon Valley Foundation chapter here, and the founder of a group, Rajiv Circle, which is supported by the Motwani Jadeja Family Foundation. I live in the world of technology, and Sanjay, it was fascinating to hear about what you're talking about. My question is around technology and its role in participatory budgeting, as well as citizens' voices being heard. Here we come across people from like CGNet Swara, which is revolutionizing tribal India with a mobile solution for citizen journalism. And there's a brilliant Stanford professor, Ashish Goyal, who's doing participatory decision-making using social media. But these people are struggling to connect with other organizations. And it was wonderful to hear about everyone partnering. What is a practical way as we come across such people to connect them into the systems you're talking about, people here and people anywhere in the world? Is there a way to make people more aware of that and plug in these people that they could, other people could leverage this technology?
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, you had a question? Yeah, and somebody over here. And if you can be pithy in your questions, that would be great.
I can be. It resonates with the last one. You referred to this. This is extraordinary work that's going on, but to be successful, it has to link with those who can publicize it and can engage citizens. And some places, citizens are afraid to act. And so I think, given that you're from Ashoka, I mean, Ashoka is an example of a network that is at the grassroots around the world. There are many others in this room. So I know you can't answer the question in this one panel, but I hope we can talk about it over the next few days, because that to me seems the missing link right now.
It seems like a great conversation for the small group to actually do something about this. Let's see, there's a question over there and over here. Yeah, I got you. Okay. And then we're going to do a round of, see how much we can cover.
Hi, I'm Dan Robbins. I'm Executive Director of Kaepernick Trust, Pediatric AIDS Fund Zimbabwe. We do programming exclusively in Zimbabwe. Just the geo-mapping that you're talking about and really developing that, and this goes back to also technology, it seems to we're at a time now where we've been operating in Zimbabwe 15 years, fairly large national programs, but there's such lack of transparency of who else is doing what, where, when. I mean, part of the reason I'm here today is just finding out who's doing what, where, when. And not only would it be great to hold government institutions accountable, I think that's important as well, but I think also to hold ourselves accountable, having greater transparency for who's producing what. It's great to do analysis and study. It's very expensive to do those analysis and study, but they often are not heard, and then somebody else will start another program not using that model, even though it's well shown to do good things. So we're reinventing the wheel. I'm just wondering, as you look at that geo-linking, which is very powerful and it's exciting to hear about that effort, how do we create a better map and transparency for ourselves as well?
So you mean like philanthropic organizations and NGOs that are doing work?
So that we have that same transparency, accountability amongst our peers. We do reporting, we do things, but the more visible it is, and also amplify, there's so many opportunities beyond that, amplifying each other's work. And one of the travesties I've seen is great projects funded, and then really not having the maturation or communication between small foundation, bigger foundation, larger foundation. So many projects are brilliant, charismatic, engaged people on the ground in rural areas, but there's simply no linkage between that small grant from fire, there's wonderful organizations doing small grants. How do we work together? So having that transparency, and both as a means for efficiencies, but also an accountability and transparency for ourselves. How productive are we?
Great. And the last question here. And
I'm Virgilio Viana from Brazil. First, congratulations, very nice concept and cases that you have described. And we're implementing similar approaches in the Amazon in Brazil. But it seems to me, and this in a way builds on the previous question, that there are a lot of very nice solutions out there in the world. There are lots of them, and you have described some. And this may point to a very obvious thing. How can we share more of these solutions? And the concept of South-South, which is becoming increasingly popular, is one that should be more explored. So my question is, how could we do more of these South-South exchanges and increase adoption of technologies that are already proven successful?
So a lot of questions about mapping existing efforts and connecting them into greater impact. And there was a question about youth. So I don't know.
Maybe I can take a couple of them.
Sure.
I think, thank you so much for that question on young people. You know, when we were looking at the Arab Spring and trying to understand why did it really happen, and we tried to look at the data and evidence, what was striking was the core issues of jobs and young people coming into a labor market not finding jobs, being educated but not finding jobs. And that translated to a lot of built-up resentment. And if you look at how the future looks, the projections are that the job gap is not going to be bridged unless we change the way we look at these things quite dramatically. So you have people who are better educated, you have people who are more connected, but something has to shift in order for that youth dividend, the youth energy, to be actually translated into more stable societies. I think you have the challenge certainly for sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of young people entering into the labor markets and the future, also for South Asia. In other countries, actually the populations are beginning to slow down quite a lot. So how young people are dealt with, how they are nurtured, is going to decide a lot about the future of those societies. The people talk about the demographic dividend as a good thing, as a good plus. It can also be a demographic nightmare if you do not manage that relationship well. And I'll take the last question on the South-South. I think what is amazing is how rapidly countries have moved in the last decade. This is actually one decade story. Very dramatic things have happened. And a lot of those things happened because developing countries did their own thing. They didn't necessarily accept advice many of us give. They just found creative solutions at the national level, at the provincial level. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity of sharing. I think this link between Brazil and Africa is, particularly for Lusophone Africa, is great. We set up the International Poverty Reduction Center in China just for that purpose. Because what was fascinating was that poverty reduction experience in China is phenomenal. They lifted 600 million people out of poverty, but very few people knew what had happened and why it had happened. So these were different. I think we will see much more of that as the South-South links mature and progress. It's very difficult to go from a southern country to another southern country, even when they're neighbors, because of the historic way links have been established. And I think all that is changing quite rapidly. The projections are by 2020, there'll be 120 million Chinese going overseas as tourists every year. And once they've gone to Europe and other places, they want to discover the world. But there are no easy links from one place to the other, and that is true everywhere. Brazil, India, increasingly Africa. So I think we'll see a tremendous shift in that, and I think what you're talking about, South sharing, is the core of that at all levels, and the more we do, the better it is. And maybe a final comment. There was no mention of the Millennium Development Goals, and I hope there'll be a better conversation on that. There's a huge movement out there going on, and not just the governmental level, but at the civil society level. Over 1 million voices have been integrated into very structured conversations on what should be the successor arrangements of the Millennium Goals. The post-2015 agendas are very profound, and how we deal with them will decide the future of the world. And it would be wonderful if all the people gathered here, and I know that colleagues are going to have this breakfast meeting, so I'm doing a plug for them as well, for UNDP and the Hilton Foundation, that get involved. This is your world, this is your planet, and this is your future. Thank you.
I was hoping you will mention Millennium Goals, so great.
Thanks. So on the question from Nigeria on youth groups, I wanted to just say that in terms of these various transformations, let me just give you one example where youth groups can play an incredible role, which is in getting together and amplifying the voices of the poor. And I'll give you a concrete example. We were doing an urban project in Tandale in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. It's a very poor slum. And there was no information on what the assets that the community had. You just knew where a church and a mosque was on a map. That's all. Tandale couldn't have existed for that matter. And university students in Dar es Salaam partnered with community slum dwellers and used mobile phones to map, just like Marina was saying. They themselves geo-mapped their whole community to say where were the health points, the water points, the schools. And then they mapped citizen feedback, the students did, on which health points, which water points were not working. And you could aggregate it in red bubbles, which red bubbles became the collective voices of the poor. This was done by the youth groups. And youth groups can play an incredible role in a number of areas, but certainly in this. And if you know youth groups that want to work in this, they can apply for grants with the Global Partnership for Social Accountability that I talked about. They can get grants to amplify that voice, and governments can respond to that. First, that was the first point. On the point from Ashoka, and the very innovative work, which I didn't know, thank you, I'd love to know more, on what's happening in tribal India and how to connect to others. The first thing is there is a network of civil society organizations in Asia, many of them, but there's one devoted to that kind of thing, which is called the Affiliated Network of Social Accountability. The one for South Asia is based in the Philippines at Ateneo University. And it would be very good for them to connect to peers who are doing this. And this links up to the question on South-South exchange and what Khalid said. I think we are doing a lot of South-South exchanges between governments, working with the UN and with governments. Not enough is happening amongst civil society organizations on this innovations that foundations are supporting and many others. So I wanted to propose something. Just a thought came to my mind. I chair a South-South facility, which is a unique trust fund where most of the donors are middle-income countries. You know, most of the funds have the OECD countries. This one has China, India, Brazil, Russia, and so on. Now, that's usually financing South-South exchanges amongst governments. And if there was interest, we could create a window with foundations and others which facilitates South-South exchanges amongst civil society organizations on this. If you're interested, you can contact me and so on. The last point on geomapping is a very good one. And what I wanted to share with you, one thing is we do need to indeed geomap ourselves meaning the entire community represented here, donors, and so I'm just beginning with that point. And I do want to suggest a concrete mechanism again. The Open Aid partnership that has been launched, which was initially the World Bank and donors, has now increased to international civil society organizations. Foundations have joined, some foundations have joined. That could be a platform where you can jointly geomap all assistance, government, civil society, foundations, this, that. And I invite you to contact us because there are already foundations and civil society. So, you know, it's fascinating. You see a map of Malawi, for instance, and you can see 20 donors, foundations, and so on, all showing where their projects are located and correlated with infant mortality or poverty reduction. You can locate it all on a map. Malawi is one of the countries. We're now working in 3 or 4 countries to actually show how this can be done, and we'd be happy to work with you. I have to apologize one thing. I have to go catch a flight because I have a meeting in Washington. But my colleague Penelope Lewis is here. If any of you want to follow up on any of these things, send me an email or Penelope can follow up.
Great. Rachel.
Thanks. I wanted to get back to this idea that, you know, there's lots of different work being done by different groups. And I agree it can sound incredibly confusing because you hear different stories, this worked, this didn't. That was actually one of the reasons why JPAL was established. This is the center at MIT that I run. And we bring together a network of 100 academics in universities around the world. And we try and do sort of proper synthesis of what does all the evidence say out there, because particularly for donors, it can be very confusing to sort out the kind of cacophony of noises and stories out there. And I think it's important, as I say, not just to say, does this project work, does it not? But what are we understanding from the whole landscape of all the different things that have been tried, and when do things work and where do they not? So this is one, I mean, there are other people doing it. The bank puts together a similar analysis. But you can talk to me or reach out through our website. We also have regional offices. So there are similar centers to what we're doing at MIT in the regions. The University of Cape Town for Africa, Paris School of Economics for Europe, University of Indonesia for Southeast Asia. So these are all places where they can help synthesize the results. And I also want to say that there are an increasing number of funding opportunities that say that, for example, Development Innovations Ventures at USAID, which says, let's take the things for which there's evidence and scale them. We will, if you come with innovative new ideas and there's evidence that they work, we want to scale them. And I think that's an exciting complement to what we've been talking about, so that we don't just have endless small pilots of things that work, but there are people saying, let's take those pilots, and if you can prove that they're effective, we'll help you to scale them at a much bigger level.
Great. Thank you so much. I know we just scratched the surface of this very rich conversation, but thank you very much for participating. And